Feel encouraged to take a seat. This is our final panel of the conference, and that is terrific. I just want to say, I'm excited to be here at the final panel. But I also want to say, like, this kind of inaugurates everything else that we were able to get away with. We have Poets Theater coming up this evening, followed by a wonderful marathon reading. And then tomorrow we have the self-directed walking tour, a screening at the Roxy. And then we all end up in bed together with a reading at the Mattress Factory with Eileen and Dennis, which is as it should be. So please look to your program for more details about that. But most importantly, right after this is over, we'll be walking down to the Berkeley Art Museum for Poets Theater. It's pretty close, like 10-minute walk, but let's try to be punctual. It's starting at 4:45. It's starting at 4:45, and it's the museum, so let's try to be on time for them. Also, there are more anthologies of the Poets Theater from Kenning Editions available for free at the bookstore, which again is just down the hall. Please pick up your free copy of the Kenning's anthology. All right, now I would like to welcome Sarah Rosenthal.
Does this sound okay? Sounds good. Sounds good to me. Welcome to Porous Borders New Narrative Writers Read. So this panel features an impressive 40-something year span from Bruce to Rob. Bruce mentored Bob. Bob taught Camille and Rob and me. Rob is now editing Bruce's selected works. Age is a real thing, and each literary generation represented here necessarily employs new narrative writing to address a somewhat different constellation of patterns, of passions and concerns. At the same time, this panel demonstrates the way literature is blind to things like biological age. All of the panelists featured today continue to engage rigorously and creatively with the life of the mind. And I'm looking forward to hearing how both the generational differences and the literary common ground shared here will make itself felt in the presentations we're going to hear. First, I'd like to share a bit about my own relationship to new narrative. About Bob's book, it's funny how I like my own relationship and then I'm talking about Bob. I think that's kind of natural. About Bob's book, Jack the Modernist, Barrett Watton had this to say: "You get to have your cake and eat it too." Actually, that binary doesn't even begin to suggest all the room new narrative provides for contradictions, confessions and lies, loopholes and elaborations and ellipses, multiple gestures and modes, multiple selves, emptied out selves who nevertheless have a lot more to say. Like so many of us, I was drawn to new narrative and its fellow travelers. And by fellow travelers, I mean writers like Eileen Miles, Chris Kraus, Lydia Davis, Kathy Acker. But I also mean the much wider range of fiction writers Bob introduced his grad students to in San Francisco State's MFA program. Bob's course readers were like curated gallery exhibitions, mixing the work of mainstream masters with that of edgy pals of his in ways that made us see new things about both. Or maybe they were like crowded elevator rides where Basho elbows John Berger and Doris Lessing asks Lynn Tillman to push the button for floor 5. Robert Valser would prefer to take the stairs, thank you. And by fellow travelers, I also mean the poetry my colleagues and I were introduced to by other professors, especially Myung Kim, Aaron Shuren, who's here today, Peter Weltner, and Wei Lung Kwok, along with visiting poets such as Michael Palmer and Norma Cole. We encountered a rich tradition of avant-garde writing, starting with Dickinson and Whitman and extending to people who sat next to me in workshops and readings. The majority of the work we read, all of it, was based on utopian principles generated by art movements created through resistance to other movements. I was interested in that. But what I most treasured was the state of constant intoxication I was in from the cross-fertilization of all these literatures. The reading practices implied in Bob's readers and in the melange of influences I was steeping myself in gave me the sense that as a writer, I can truly have my cake and eat it too, and do anything else with cake that I can think of. Document making a cake, or give out samples on the street, or get all Carolee Schneemann and do body art with it. This permissive freedom led to my cross-genre book, Manhattan. Outside of Bob's day job, of course, he and Bruce were developing and teaching the tenets and tools of new narrative in non-institutional workshops, engagement with theory, the notion of text metatext, a fluid and complex relation to autobiography, high meets low, gossip and the sense of writing for a small, overheated community, collage, inclusion of sex and bodies, the mixing of scales. Over time, the sense of urgency underscoring Bob and Bruce's invention of new narrative has become more apparent, as have factors in their own experiences that fed that urgency. Such factors include their experience as queer writers and political animals before and during the age of AIDS, Bruce's background as a novitiate in the Catholic Church, and then as a member of a Marxist study group, and both writers' frustrated encounter with the relation to selfhood, posited by language poetry on the one hand and movement writing on the other, not to mention their deep friendship and shared devotion to communitarian ideals. And many writers who took Bob's writing workshop share their intense commitments to new narrative. The word utopia appeared in every book I looked at in preparation for this panel, and I've been hearing it all weekend. I'm sure you have too. The tenets and tools of new narrative haven't limited other writers or quashed their personalities. This is kind of like my little neoliberal je ne sais quoi seeping through here that I'm like so protective of individual personalities, I guess. To read Camille's writing, or Rob's, or Doty's, or Kevin's, as just a few examples of new narrative writers, is to read work that clearly shares principles and techniques first articulated by Bob and Bruce, but that also carries the force of compelling, highly evolved individual imaginations grappling with pressing contemporary issues. And I think Bob and Bruce would be the first to say that their fellow travelers are dear to them as humans and writers. And I know that at one point anyway, they had reservations about new narrative becoming institutionalized. I also know that for all artists, it's important to keep growing and experimenting. Los Angeles sculptor Liz Larner, whose work I recently became aware of, talks about the artist being someone who gets to, is even required to change their mind and keep following whatever path their ideas take them on. So with the advent of this exciting conference, Kevin and Doty's anthology and Robin Tremblay-McGaw's not forthcoming, it's here, anthology. One question is, in light of this increased canonization, might new narrative lose the porosity of its borders and become a reified set of procedures? And again, this is something we've been wondering about, I think, the whole weekend. I picture students in university creative writing programs across the nation having their new narrative writing assignments graded on rubrics featuring items such as story includes gossip 1 in every paragraph, 2 a few times in the story, or 3 never. These are the questions I was pondering when the call for proposals came out for this conference. After some head scratching, it occurred to me that by asking first and later generation new narrative writers to describe their own current reading practices, we can explore how new narrative can continue to unfold in real time. I'm interested in hearing what's on each panelist's reading list and how these choices were arrived at, but also how the panelists situate those texts and authors in relationship to their own commitment to new narrative. What old narrative or other work is still vital to them, and why? If so, what is the perceived value of those texts, and how do they feed a new narrative project? How do the texts these authors read challenge, or at least complicate their working definition of new narrative? Those are some of the questions that come to me, but I'm sure the panelists will expand on the topic in ways I could not have predicted, and I'm sure that you all brilliant people, writers and readers, will have your own juicy questions to add to the mix in the Q&A period after the presentations. So I told Dana Teen Lomax, who many of you know, that I didn't want to do traditional bios, and she said, how about new narrative bios? Great idea. So here's Dana's bio slash poem slash narrative slash love letter to Rob, collaging phrases from his work. To love like this in America could bring the whole fucking system down. Someone speaks of the collateral to keep the house. How I go on loving him for that. We were once ourselves a small thing seeking heat, repeating what won't go down. A hot day laborer using my shirt to wipe his jizz. A bleeding guy in uniform. When we emerge from the mud, we all have names, rivaling the demands of other historical processes, shopping, fucking, obscene intimacies. If you're quiet, you might hear the war moving through every sound I make. Open forms absorb this shit in my mouth. Whatever my body craves has already been sold as the normal way of belonging to the things that own me. Where some relation begins to cohere, there are so many things I want to tell you. Please welcome Rob Halpern.
Might be a little hard at first. I'm holding back some emotion. Can you hear me? I feel I'm speaking softly. Is that okay that I speak softly? It's just such a daunting honor to be presenting work with Camille and Bruce and Bob, all of whom I count among the most important figures in my writing life, and I can honestly say without whose work I wouldn't be who I am, and I can say that with deep felt honesty and love. I want to say too that in 1989, when I moved to San Francisco, one of the first things I did, maybe it was around 1990, was I looked up in the white pages Bob's address and Aaron Shuren's home address and Kathy Acker's home address. They were just three names of writers that I thought I had something that I wanted to apprentice myself to, and sent them, cold calls with probably a pretty shitty piece of writing. And I heard back from both Bob and Aaron. It took a little while, but that was really one of the most beautiful and significant gestures for me. I never heard from Kathy. And that moved me to meet Bob. Aaron actually pointed me to Dodie and Kevin, whose workshop I participated in, before Dodie introduced me finally to Bob, despite the fact that we had a correspondence. It took me a few more years to meet him. So together with many others here in this room, I participated in a number of extra-institutional workshops in writers' homes, and really none of this came from the academy, despite everyone having half a foot inside that door. I also wanted to mention that something that Robin and I didn't talk about this morning, and that is that even in Bob's workshops, and say in 1998, there was a moment that I remember so clearly when I turned to Robin, or it may have been Jocelyn, or maybe it was Kathy Lou or Dana, and I whispered, and I was like, "What's new narrative?" That was after a year of being at the workshop. It was like, what is it? So I really think that's the beginning of at least my intimate engagement, to figure out, what is this thing that we feel a part of, but may not ever have an adequate definition. So I was going to share with you something new that I started in response specifically to Sarah's prompt, and that was going to be about some moribund literary genre called gay fiction. And I was going to do that by way of Garth Greenwell's recently acclaimed novel, What Belongs to You? which is pretty terrific, but also I think it's an exquisite illustration of a literary event that perfectly corroborates and unwittingly endorses our full-blown neoliberal condition. I mean, what belongs to you, right? And I was going to do that in relation to Bo Houston's Remember Me, which is a novel that Bo published in 1991, whose narrator is on the cusp of succumbing to AIDS-related illness, which Bo himself would do in the coming several years. And the only reason that I'm sort of rehearsing for you a talk that I thought I was going to share, but I'm not, is because part of the motivation there was to bring Bo Houston's name into this space and room, and so I just did that. So what I'm going to share with you is actually part of a larger project. It's also in sync with Sarah's prompt, but more immediately in response to a prompt that Bob sent to me almost a year ago, asking me to write something in response to the word touch, which coincided beautifully with a larger project I've been working on called My Augustine, which excavates my own unresolved trauma around death and loss in the 90s, specifically the death of my first love in 1995. So there's that. And The Hole, with an epigraph from Emily Dickinson, a not admitting of the wound until it grew so wide that all my life had entered it, and there were troughs beside. It's just to the right of the spine, about 1/8 of an inch in diameter and barely abutting one of the 3 most prominent vertebrae. Were you to imagine a line parallel to the earth and moving into his body from this small portal protruding from the back's smooth surface, such a line would pass through the lower quadrant of the right lung where the fungus finds hospitable repose. This is an effect of sarcoidosis, an immune deficiency disorder that causes inflammation to multiple organs, but mostly the lungs and lymph glands. What triggers the disease remains unclear, but I've often pegged James's illness to the degraded working conditions he suffered as a kid, exposure to factory tar, rubber, and toxic VOCs. Though this may be a dream, and it doesn't matter, as the lungs become ripe terrain for whatever might want to live there, hostess with the mostess, to an aspergillus fungus whose spongy balls of mold eat into organ tissue, creating pockets where eventually there will be no capacity for normal breathing. The line I mentioned above, the one running from hole to lung, is not imaginary, but invasive, precise, hygienic. A thin route guiding the catheter, which had been inserted surgically to communicate a chemical compound and erode the fungal mass. My role was to inject the fluid daily into the lung by way of the portal, and then, after several minutes, to suck out the resulting debris through a plastic suction, bits of crummy dough clotting in seminal juice, a phlegmy aspic. My intimate relation to this hole is antecedent to my fantasies of other holes, a soldier's wound, for example, around which I organized a whole book of poems, never once thinking about James's back, and several years later the catheter reappeared disguised as the feeding tube of a hunger-striking detainee at Guantanamo Bay, and then the ligature with which he allegedly hanged himself. These lines of flight, metaphors, or transports have been persistent, operative, and submerged to the point of my own misrecognition. They are figures for relation, or fledgling ideas, holes in the body, Artaud called them. Were you to follow that line with your eye, or a thread, or a sentence, it might lead to a place in the lung where the mass accrues its deadly weight, a measure that's become the measure of my song, like a court date in Kansas, far from green-collared bones, or a febrile comb of cork bark and tights, an Iraqi kite caught cortado in weave, my phalangeal cornea his dehiscent wound. A gymnopod crotch of flummox and creed, a commie spelunker cooing toxic drywall, a dry-rating floozy high on kerosene and pool, my spoon-fed flunky purling soil and twigs, my genital disease creaming noodles in wax, an archival orchid pollinating otters and corrosive irons of Copernicus doom, contaminating dropsy and galloping fog, simchas and coffee puking tombs to toast, salivating cordon, conspiring dawns, celebrating condoms, constipating night, lacerated onion frost, crenellating arctics, and dream-fried tortillas caked up with rouge, a powdery frill surrounding my anus, calliope frag of shipping lane linnets, my songbird snatch, and ferreting spooge. In other words, touching the hole in James's back is the closest I've come to touching nothing. And while this is untrue, it has become the measure of my truth. A hole is a portal, though not to any place outside this fantasy of touch, my dream of pulling back the skin to expose ingress, when the whole disjunction of in and out collapses like a star along a linear fold some call horizon and others call seam, one line or figure that resolves in a face, and when your face caves in, it collapses like a star on the back of my head before bursting into flower or flame. Maybe the slip occurs in such a dream as one whole becomes another in an open sequence of negations whose origin is a port in your back and whose terminus is a gulf in a body reduced to goods, another hole exposed, vacant, undressed before I find my finger severed, then morphed to tongue. All my fantasies bear this line of descent, rimming the hole in your back. This is both true and false, as is the figure of an abscess, figure of no figure, untouchable center of absence itself around which other bodies assume their shape and power. Under other unbearable conditions, this time geopolitical, a soldier, a detainee, a day laborer, an inmate. It's strange that it's not your asshole I think of when I think of our intimacy. It's rather this hole in your back become emblem and through which a catheter ran when I thought I could save you, though I didn't. I wanted to take care of you the way I want to take care of myself when I flee. But care of the self must mean not to care for one's immunities, which are deadly, the way power kills in the name of security and security destroys to be safe. It's rather care of this relation, this whole in sense where fantasies of sovereignty and safety break down. And here I have found my theme at last. I'm just going to plug this Daniel? Dust. Mike Kelly's untitled Dust Balls. 13 silver gelatin photographic prints of laundry lint harvested from a dryer trap. Resurrect the fungus. I love the curator's use of the word harvested, as if lint were alive. I saw these photos recently upon visiting the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, where 9 of the 13 hang, and they astonished me. The pictures deliver a shock, as if they were obscene, these balls of fiber and dust. Are they galactic? Are they cellular? Floating in a viscid ether, suspended in pulmonary space, and I'm turned on by seeing them, my arousal being an effect of repressed association. It's as if I've always imagined James's fungus balls like this, even though I never really imagined them at all. I mean, I never had to picture the moldy wads in my head, the clots having never required a visual representation or haptic analog. So entwined are they with my senses to the point of enveloping them. And I'm obsessed with this image, mine, a fusion of all Kelly's dust balls transfigured by imagination, desire, and touch, which erupts like a coup de foudre. So condensed and displaced is this feeling of immediacy, and I throw the image back in time to the point where it can only have been there all along, a permanent fixture of memory and dream. But there's a lag in this sequence, for it's not until after seeing Kelly's photographs, almost a week after, in fact, that I begin to feel this image become animate, a relic of James's body buried in my own, anvil of ear, valve of heart, the way the opaque mystery of Kelly's photos, whose resistance to reference seemed absolute upon first encounter, required a period of gestation before overwhelming me, loosening itself like a fossil at last prepared to reveal the carcass it once was. It's not that Kelly's balls of laundry lint look like the blobs of mold burrowed in his lungs. Who could ever make such a silly comparison? But rather that Kelly's balls of lint are those clots of mold. The photos capture the mystery of the fungal gunk, and when the image erupts, it's as if it had been living inside as its meaning moves through my body's interior, vast abysses of a biospace so remote from experience as to be otherworldly, extraterrestrial, alien, while absolutely proximate, intimate with my own inner life, as if what I am seeing has its origin in me. The truthfulness of this is not aesthetic, an effect of mimesis, semblance, or verisimilitude. It's ontological. I can only call the effect of Kelly's photos uncanny, as I fall under the spell of something whose sudden sense of intimacy is utterly familiar and totally strange, as if I were feeling the fibers in these spongy clumps of cotton and wool, the way they themselves once touched skin. This is how the finest thread extending from one of Kelly's lint balls, a strand resembling whisker or antenna, becomes my own sensory organ, and the sensation resuscitates the space inside James's lung. Without having yet grasped the associations upon seeing them, the image had yet to coalesce, yet to erupt. I took photos of Kelly's photos and even put them on rotation on the splash page of my phone. So I've been seeing them daily, and they've even entered my dreams. The way the language of a detainee's autopsy report once did, around which my sense of touch would become deranged. Upon waking, I pull an endless gob of cum and fur from a fold inside my fluff, a blob of slime from a crease in my mouth, a wad of jism from a cusp in the drain, a ball of hair from a tube in the tub, a glob of mold from my wrinkle of lint, a clump from a pleat, a spot from a cuff, or a bead of life from a lung. Like a clot removed from the aorta, a growth from beneath the tongue, a polyp retrieved from a lover's bowel, a corn from the heel, or a living lump removed from dream, a swelling, a bump, a knob, a bulge, a bulb. There's a residue of shame in looking at these things, something I'm reminded of this morning in bed when I fall on a sentence while reading Guibert. The shame of being on the side of life and catching oneself with an erection while looking at death. This is the uncanny, the way a thing most dead returns most alive, the way something so inimitable returns in the form of something so banal, the way something repressed assumes a form so alien while arousing its most intimate familiars, or the way the sensuous converges with the fossilized, like the final trill in Beethoven's Last Piano Sonata, which is about as close to death as music can come. One interminably drawn-out convention whose beauty gets hollowed out, becoming a fossil of itself before the final note and decay of sound. The meaning of touch is not like touching anything at all. It's rather like touching touch itself, now wedded to wound, scabbed to hole, glued to the body's fluid space, where touch dissolves in the corrosiveness of enzyme. Strung out in formaldehyde, these figures hang, suspended lash, each image a prosthetic of my own imagination turned inward as I enter a fantasy caress, making contact with what my contact failed to touch when he died. as laundry lint becomes forensic evidence, limit of my meaning, testimony to crime and care. And so my recall is delayed, as if the visual rhymes had been buried somewhere in a film or a cache or a crease or a snag, lying in wait for this writing to arouse and transform. Dusty lint or fungal mass, the operation is the same as before, slip and transpose, slip and transpose. I've made a series of substitutions in a chain of exchanges as the distinction between care and violence collapses. Or it's as if each of Kelly's dust balls were the acme of evidence, pictures of my fingerprints, for they look like that too, forensic proof that I was there, and this is what I'm up against. The gravure of touch, now frozen in gray amber, in amniotic matter, the way it captures and frames my sham, which only mourning will assuage, whose work my identification with the image blocks. For to mourn would be to let dust be dust, and lint be lint, no fantasy ID, no prosthetic extension of me. This alone would mark the crucial accomplishment. Only when identity, this reduction to my meaning system, betrays the ruse of its immunity, will the promise of community open to this mourning. To arrive at the threshold of touch, the cusp of care, where care of the self dissolves in relation, refusing the self as boundary and ban. To look at things so dead and spiritless without imputing any relation to myself. This would be an achievement equal to forgiveness, or at least an acknowledgement of error as the guilty ground of forgiveness itself gives way. My future hangs on the decomposition of this image, so that lint will once again be lint and rest on meaning nothing. No biomorphic significance, no somatic incorporation, no forensic fingerprint, no meaningful attachment, no identification. The goal? To destroy the effect of the image, to undo the terms of this repression and its logic of substitution, this chain of displacements that moves by slippage and transposition, the way meaning slides from dust to grief, as if this lint were alive in my lung, the way this flint is alive in my song, or a word cracks belief in the wake of a stone, how a dime spins its tail on a wave in the wind, or a snail in a beak, or a bead in a braid, a fork in my coke, or a cup fin elope, as a leaf craves for smoke in the stall of a bone. Your mirror says what I put in its face, a dream of relief imparting no grace. I come to your love in the wormwood of thought to set my drafty clarinet down.
Thank you so much, Rob. So Kevin Killian jumped at the chance to write a bio for Camille. Camille Roy is, of course, one of the great geniuses of contemporary writing and the author of 6 books incorporating many genres. What some don't know is that the disgraced hoax J.T. Leroy may have based his pseudonym on hers, Exhibit A. I remember going into Aardvark about 12 years ago, and on their shelves behind the counter sat a copy of Camille's book, Swarm, marked up like Joe Orton in a peculiar way. The CAMIL of Camille Roy had been X'd out, replaced by a large Sharpied black JT. It had been signed by J.T. Leroy, and the salesman told me it had been bought from the author themselves. That's why it was $250. I didn't buy it, but oh, how I wish I had. At any rate, I said to the bookseller, "This is no rare J.T. Leroy book. thinking that if they understood this, they would take it out of circulation. It's a book by Camille Roy. They seemed to bow to my logic, but when I returned 6 weeks later, it was still on their shelf with the other collectibles. So, by the way, if you're not familiar, if you're not familiar with the J.T. Leroy hoax, you can look it up online, like we do everything else.
That was delicious. Yeah, so, faced with this prospect of talking about my reading, I realized that I was consumed with trying to read my own life because my partner's illness over the last year. So I wrote a piece that kind of drags the panel topic in a different direction. It's called Reading My Catastrophe. But before I actually read it, I want to do something I always forget. I want to say thank you for the incredibly wonderful conference and for all the work that went into it. I want to thank this wonderful panel for being themselves so generously for so long. Thank you so much. So, I don't know what this is going to be like. We'll see how it goes. It's called Reading My Catastrophe. The mind ends in a sort of swamp. We are swamp creatures, paddling around in the mud and mangroves of our neural landscape. I also imagine a horizon with a fringe of reeds and little lights, maybe fireflies. That is the boundary where mind turns into nature. You can wait there for a gust of spirit. That is where I dream. A cat curled next to me, the one who used to curl next to you. I knew you would come with a word for me. A tender flutter, a wing, syllables. The medium opened her palm, and there I saw it. When things feel unbearable. That's not it exactly. It was the sudden rise up of incomprehension. Have you ever had those moments where you know you don't have the resources or capacity to deal with what is coming next, or even understand it? I don't know about you, and that is partly because my state of unknowing has become so large. I know this about myself. I'm not porous enough, big enough, small enough to fit through the whole of the next hour. It's the roller crasher. The weird thing about steep decline and death is that it doesn't feel real. It feels like a life blasted open until it reaches the nooks and crannies of superstition, coincidence, pitiful moments, sorrows, vast stores of tenderness. July 1st, 2017. Ooh, what's that? Should I speak? What am I doing? Is that? I have to step back.